Damon Galgut, I have read your novel, The Promise, in the span of one single day. And it wasn't that kind of literary addiction that one gets from a policier or a thriller, but rather a personal quest towards understanding the dysfunctionalities of a family on the background of social and political changes. When writing the book, did you want to showcase this particular background as a catalyst, or the sheer drama of a regular family?
I started, I guess, with my attention on the drama of I say a regular family, but they're very dysfunctional family, which of course many normal families are. So I guess in the beginning, my concern was really much more personal and much more tied up with this particular group of people. But as I spent time with the idea, I realized that by widening the focus a little bit, I could also show in the background what was happening to the nation of South Africa, because a nation has a life just like a family has a life, just as an individual does. And nations, of course, undergo big dramatic changes. And we've had a few of those here recently. So, you know, the first idea for this book came from a conversation with a friend telling me about his family funerals, the ones he'd been to. And I thought, well, that's a nice, or at least an interesting way to tell the history of a family. And then I realized that, you know, if you space the funerals out, one in a different decade, that the life of South Africa shows up in the background. And in the same way that a reader might be able to notice the family has changed, they will hopefully also notice that the country has changed too.
Your novel is, in my opinion, at least, one about loss and about time. You, as an author, deal with them differently than your non-fictional self?
Well, I don't do that much non-fiction, to be honest. I mean, I'm occasionally asked to write reviews or articles, and I do that, but it doesn't come as naturally or as easily to me as, you know, fiction does. I'm not sure if that's the question you're actually asking me, though.
Actually, I was asking you about your own relationship with loss and time, because prior to being an author, so living the life of all your characters, living all their situations, living all their contexts, you are a human being, first and foremost. And sometimes we have different approaches to time, to loss, to grief, as human beings, as opposed when having a different kind of persona as that of an author.
Well, authors are human too, as yes. You said. So, you know, you write usually out of what is preoccupying you. So, you know, time and the passage of time is a big preoccupation for me as I get older. And the end of that journey for each of us is death. Hence the 4 funerals in the book, I guess. But, you know, I haven't lost close family members. I still have my parents and brother and sister, unlike, you know, the family in this book. And I haven't had to deal with grief, perhaps in quite such an up-close and intimate way. I have lost people close to me, and of course I'm familiar with what loss feels like and dreaded. But really, there was a slight guilt involved for me in writing this book, because you're imagining the death of a parent or a sibling, and it feels daring or even tempting fate to imagine these things when your family is still alive. In fact, you know, that's all it is, imagination. But I am, of course, exploring what it means to lose people. Because ultimately that's what being human is. You lose everything. You lose your family members, your friends, and ultimately yourself. So, you know, this is a depressing fact about being human, that we're here in a temporary way. And I guess the book is looking at that, yeah.
We have Anton, we have Astrid, and we have Amor, 3 siblings coping with the death of their parents, then with their own disappearance successively. Their names start all with the letter A. Was that intentional, like starting all over again?
I didn't have such a clearly formulated plan in mind, I have to admit. Sometimes as a writer, you just go with what your imagination throws up. And my imagination threw up the three names all with A, and I thought, well, that's odd. But it's odd in an interesting kind of way. And I thought, well, if it bothers me later, I can change it, but it obviously didn't.
Yeah, fair enough. From all the characters, it is the youngest sibling, Amor, that goes through the most intense process of changing. And she's probably the one that gets the reader's compassion quite early in the book. In fact, we draw our favorites from the first dozens of pages. Are you okay with this kind of partisanship among the readers?
Well, it's inevitable, you know, because what holds your attention in the book? You have to in some way feel as if you're part of it. Usually you identify with a character or a group of characters, if not with them, with the situation that they're in. Something in you has to feel empathy or sympathy. That's difficult in the case of this book because so many people in the book are quite unpleasant. But you know, as we can see in certain modern TV or streaming series like Succession, it's not always important to have likable characters. You can dislike everybody and still be very involved, if on some level even the unlikable characters remind you of yourself. So yes, you're correct. I mean, the most likable, approachable person in this family is definitely the younger daughter, Amor. And that's basically because she has moral feelings about what the right thing is to do when the people around her either don't have those feelings or they ignore those feelings. So we tend to identify with the moral center of the book, no? Even if we're not very moral people ourselves as readers, we tend to identify with the person who's taking some sort of moral action. So I don't argue with that observation.
As your writing unfolds, you seem to count on a very attentive and participative reader, prepared to follow you as the voices swirl and meander. Do you actually have an ideal reader in mind when writing a book?
That's an interesting question. No, I don't really think about a particular person reading the book. I guess I am very attentive to the reality that people have to understand what they're reading and that it has to provide some sort of pleasure. But I guess if I have a human figure in mind, it's a kind of a version of myself, somebody who would like the sort of books that I like, who likes the kind of breaking with traditional narrative that I like. Somebody who's prepared to be a little bit unusual and adventurous in their taste and not to receive the usual, you know, neat package that provides a kind of a comfort or a consolation. So yeah, I guess my ideal reader, if there is such a person, is me in some abstract form.
Then you, as your ideal reader, are you easily satisfied with your own writings?
No, not at all. No,
I thought so, yes.
I mean, this is a basic rule. I mean, I do a little bit of teaching work with students. And the hardest thing to persuade students of is that, you know, I think for young people, and that was true for me when I was young too, that you have an intense experience writing something, you feel you connected with the material and wow, you did it. But in fact, that's just the first step, because after the heat, there has to be some cool, and the cool comes from your brain. So in a strange way, you have to be inside the work, making creative decisions, but you also have to be outside it, making judgments. And the judgments are on yourself. If I was reading this coldly, if somebody else wrote this, how would I perceive it? And that split in your mind between connection and disconnection is probably what messes writers up more than anything. But in the judgmental phase, I'm very, very hard on myself. I think you have to be. You have to be your strongest critic, and then maybe you will deal with the problems before other real critics, come to the book.
Going back a bit to a topic we have previously touched, prior to actually experiencing them, we have learned about the life's major emotions, such as loss and grief, as we were talking about, from books as well. Do you remember the books that made your heart break?
You mean as a young reader?
As a young reader or not so young reader, because we are entitled to this kind of major emotions through a book at any age, in my opinion, at least.
Yeah, of course. There are some books that have done that for me, but they're probably not books that would break most people's hearts. Sebald, W.G. Sebald, the German writer, breaks my heart. So does Samuel Beckett, in fact. I mean, writers who manage to articulate some or other aspect of being human, which I recognize, which any reader can recognize as a profound insight into what it is to be, alive with this particular consciousness. I'm very moved by that. I mean, I guess I'm moved by how well people do the thing rather than the thing itself. So, sentimental stories or stories that exercise your emotions, that tends not to break my heart. It's not the skill of the practitioner that I find heartbreaking,
Nadine Gordimer, J.M. Coetzee, and yourself, just three of the most prominent names in South African literature. Apart the apartheid, what else unites your voices in a common choir, let's say?
Well, that's a difficult question. I've read both of them, of course, and both of them were big figures for me, towering figures in a pretty small landscape, actually. Coetzee is someone I relate to much more. I guess because in the time of Gordimer, South African writing was a writing of resistance, and very often that meant leading the way, I guess, for white readers to show them what the right attitude is and the right way to resist an immoral system. So Gordimer was very, very engaged politically. Everything.
Yes, she was. Yes.
Political moment. I don't relate to that way of seeing things so much. For me, politics is very central, but there are aspects of life that fall outside that range. Coetzee, for me, had a very, very personal effect because he was writing figures that were in resistance to whatever the prevailing system was. But at the same time, they were deeply flawed people themselves with, compromised moral attitudes. And this was something I recognized that, I don't like this idea of creating heroic literary figures as examples for people because most people are not that heroic. In real life. And I mean, I include myself in that. I think most of us are looking after our own interests in some way. And yet we do take moral decisions and sometimes very difficult ones for ourselves. So I recognize the ambivalence and the conflict around morality. I would say that for both Gordimer and Coetzee, it was very important to write well. And I think of another, not a South African writer, but a South American writer, Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Said, of course.
When he was asked about political writing, he said he saw it as his revolutionary duty to write well. And if there's one common thread, I think it's the aspiration to write elegantly and competently, I guess.
Then this leads me to my next question, because a good writer has been and still is a good reader as well. What makes good writing, in your opinion?
You ask some tough questions. It really depends. The bottom line with a book is, do you feel compelled to continue reading? And sometimes that compulsion can come from plot, events. You want to know what happens next. And the language and the way the language is handled is not that important. And there's, you know, let's be fair, there's a skill with that. You know, even writing a thriller or a crime drama, there's a certain skill in making it work and holding people's attention. But that is a different sort of challenge to the one that really interests me. So what is it to write well? It is to have themes. It is to have great themes that you have considered to some degree and that you are able to face up to through language. I guess, I mean, to put it in very, very big and broad terms. So I look for the pleasure of language used well. That in itself incidentally can hold your attention too. I mean, one of the decisions I took with this book is that it's not driven by plot. You know, the only plot is what is happening to this family, which is not really a plot. It's what time does. So I made a decision early on that the only way I was going to hold the attention of readers was through language. And I needed to make the experience of the language rich enough to keep people's attention. So, you know, in a certain sense, the project you're working with depends on the particular book. Another book I've written might have depended on plot far more. But you have to rise to the particular challenge you set yourself, which also means you have to recognize what the challenge is. So I can't give you a very neat, boiled down answer. I can only give you a big, messy one, I'm afraid.
That was okay. And I have to tell you, I love this, the pleasure of the language used well. I absolutely love this. So thank you very much. Now, moving to another topic, we have social injustice, we have convulsions, troubled times, political or environmental or crisis. They frequently fuel first-rank literature. And I was wondering why peace and harmony and beauty and tolerance seem to be paradoxically far less inspirational.
I don't know why that is. It is something about human nature that your attention is held by conflict. I think something in people wants conflict to be resolved. So if you create a dramatic situation that has an inherent conflict, something in people is alerted to the fact that this is something that requires a resolution. And the pleasure of storytelling, I guess, is that climactically you're supposed to provide a resolution, and people feel, the world was fractured, but it's been put back together. I think what dissatisfies and disturbs people is with the feeling that the world is not repaired by the end of the story, that things have not been resolved. I like to push that line a little bit because the real world is very often not resolved. No, things remain fractured and unsorted. But I don't know what it is in human nature that finds conflict far more interesting than harmony. But I feel it myself. I mean, I'm a big fan of Dostoevsky, but impressive though it is, a book like The Idiot, which is essentially putting forward a vision of human goodness and harmony, for me, that's a more difficult book to engage with than Crime and Punishment. I mean, that may say something about me in particular, but I think, I mean, there are exceptions, right? So Marilyn Robinson, who is a deeply religious writer, and her book Gilead, there is almost no conflict. I mean, the conflict that is in there is of a very, very minute and subtle nature, and yet she still manages to hold you there. But I think what holds you there is not so much the conflict, it's the kind of purity of vision, I guess. And the clarity of her moral thinking. So there are books that manage to hold you with a kind of a vision of goodness, for want of a better way of putting it. But they're few and far between. Mostly it becomes banal, it becomes boring because, yeah, there's no fighting.
Exactly, less drama.
Yeah.
The Booker is one of the most coveted prizes in the literary world, and as opposed to the Nobel Prize, far less politically controversial. How did it change your creative life?
Well, I know it's been quite a few months already, but the truth is I haven't had a chance to examine how it changes my creative life, to be honest. I mean, the Booker brings a kind of a tsunami of attention, and I'm still dealing with that. I mean, the next Booker ceremony will happen in October, and maybe after that, I can return to my previous life and see what has changed and what hasn't. I mean, what is certainly true is people perceive you differently. So I'm still the same writer. I still write the same sorts of books, but there's a difference in how people regard you, which is, of course, gratifying in one way. I'm human. I have an ego, which responds to some polishing sometimes, but in another way is a little bit ridiculous to me, because it was the same book before the Booker Prize. There's no need to read it in a different way, or to read me in a different way, I guess. But yeah, it's I think it's going to make my life a lot busier. It certainly made my life a lot noisier, if I can use that word. So I'm looking forward to a little bit of quiet.
Peace and quiet, yes. The fact is that a prize like this one comes with global exposure, and I suppose this kind of exposure can be sometimes exhausting or difficult to manage. Is there an unpleasant side of suddenly being on everybody's lips, on everybody's lists of reading?
Of course, it's pleasurable that people are reading the book. That's, there's no ambivalence around that particular fact. I mean, for the rest of your question, I mean, obviously a lot of interest goes to the book. Some of that interest comes to you personally. And it depends on your temperament, I guess, how much you like that, how well you cope with it. I'm a fairly private and quiet person, usually. So I have not managed that side of things maybe as well as other people. But I'm learning. And I also know this is a brief time which will fade in due course. So I'm trying to enjoy the intensity of it, but there are times when I would like to hide.
I understand. On the global platform Goodreads, The Promise holds a current rating of 3.97 from nearly 30,000 reviews. How do you relate to this kind of rating systems that more than once mark the choices of such key figures as literary agents and publishers?
Do literary agents and publishers go by Goodreads? They probably do.
You would be surprised to hear how many actually do that.
Is that right? Well,
yes.
I believe you. Platforms like Amazon or maybe Goodreads, they of course are democratic. So everyone gets to express their opinion, and in a certain way, of course, that's excellent. I don't know of any writer who reads their Amazon reviews or their Goodreads reviews and feels better about themselves, because there's a variety of responses to any piece of work. There's no such thing as a book that pleases everybody. No such book. And I can tell you right now that if Shakespeare was writing today, he'd be getting bad reviews on Goodreads or on Amazon. King Lear, too many characters, too confusing. So it's not an objective way of evaluating a piece of work. It's not where I would go if I was an editor and I was looking for how the world saw a particular book. But I suppose it's an indication of public taste in a very broad way, what works with people, what doesn't work with people. But the most interesting and, for me, the most valuable books are often the ones that break the rules. And there are lots of readers who don't like the rules broken, so they will complain about that on a platform like that. I'm not sure what value you get from listening to everybody's response, I can take criticism if I feel it's well-focused and deserved. And sometimes critics have put their finger on something which I feel is just about my own limitations. And I think I've, been big enough to accept that, yeah, you were sharp and you saw how things were. But that has hardly ever happened on a platform like Goodreads, I have to say.
My final question relates to this particular instrument, a pen. Because I know that you are a stationery aficionado, let's say, and that at least the first drafts of your books are handwritten, actually. And I find this really, really interesting because I love writing with a pen or a fountain pen myself. What kind of reinforcement of your relationship with the characters, with the situations, with your ideas do you get from actually writing them, from all this gesture, this physical gesture that is involved in your writing, as a matter of fact?
I'm not sure that it would make any difference to the creation of characters or dialogue necessarily, but it's
more intimate, more self-related, and more personal, the relationship with the situation, with the writing, with whatever you write, when it's handwritten, in my opinion, at least.
For me, it's about the physical connection between what is in my mind and what is appearing on the page. The computer is very convenient, but there's a disconnect. I do something here and then the words appear over there.
Yes, you said it far better than me. Yes, absolutely.
But, for lots of people, that's not a problem. But for me, I like the physical connection, the sense that a word is dropping down my arm, through my hand, onto the page, that I am, it's like an electrical current that is complete. So something a little bit maybe superstitious in there. I don't know, but I also write more slowly than I can type. So it gives me extra second or two with every sentence just to think. The right word? No, change the word or so. So that little bit of extra time, that rhythm suits me very well. Also, I like the record that it leaves behind of your struggle. I was looking at old notebooks today, in fact, and so many times you go wrong, you have to cross out, go back, and that whole struggle is visible there on the page. You can look at how you found your way eventually from one end of the book to the other. But with a computer, it's gone. I mean, it's just erased. So it's very clean, it's very neat, it's efficient, but it has no soul for me. The soul is the ink,
Do you have a beautiful and enjoyable handwriting?
No, I have a very bad handwriting, so I don't want to lie to you. My handwriting is something between a child's and a very old man's. But it's okay. It's my writing. It's how it is.
Well, I have written the questions for our interview today, and this is what I frequently do, as a matter of fact. Damon Galgut, thank you so much for your time and for all the ideas you have been kind enough to share with us.
It's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.